Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of Senate Joint Resolution 30, and I thank the proponents of the resolution for bringing it, and I thank the speakers who've spoken on behalf of it for opening their hearts and their minds and giving us the benefit of their wisdom in support of it. I support it so strongly because it is such a close part of my personal history. My parents met in a Nazi concentration camp. They had not met before, and they escaped, and then they hid, and then they were protected and sheltered and fed by a man called Vytautas Rinkevičius, whose name I want to speak here in his honor. He was a Lithuanian Catholic who had never met my father or my mother before the days when he started to risk his life to protect and save theirs. He had never met them before the day when he started to risk his family's life and his children's lives to protect my mother, my father, and my father's mother, all three of them. Because if he had been discovered protecting them, his wife, his children, and he would have all been killed, and he knew that. So he kept it secret for as long as he could from his wife, and kept it secret from his children, and just continued day in, day out, month in, month out, to protect them and to save them. And I think it's important to remember that, because out of the Holocaust, we learned how cruel and callous and bestial human beings can be, but it also teaches us through Vytautas Rinkevičius and others like him, and there were hundreds and thousands of people who acted like he did. It also teaches us how heroic people can be as well. And it also teaches us how, when the forces of evil are gathered and focused on one group, how it can be stopped. It is not inevitable. As long as there are people like Vytautas Rinkevičius, it need not happen. And I want to tell you about one other survivor, apart from my mother and my father. That's my uncle. He is still living in England. He was with my mother, as was all her family, in the Kaunas ghetto when they were rounded up in July of 1941. He survived, as did my mother, the big action of October the 28th, 1941, when at the Kaunas ghetto the Germans sorted the inmates into those who could work and those who couldn't. And those who couldn't were taken to the 9th Fort and shot, and those that could work were worked. In many cases worked to death. But my uncle could work and was not worked to death in the Kaunas ghetto. When it became appropriate to do so to the German interests, they moved him and thousands of others from Kovna to Dachau, and they continued to store Jews there. And then my uncle, Vova Ginsburg, in the chaos of the end of the war, was moved out of Dachau into the woods, I believe it was to the east, as were thousands and thousands of the people who had still survived and were still at that concentration camp. And as they spread out into the woods, it became impossible for the Germans who were fleeing also to keep control of them and to keep track of them. And they started to break up into different groups. And my uncle, Vova, remembers that as he was leaving and struggling through the forest, weak, skinny and emaciated, he collapsed And came to hours later in the forest and looked up and saw an American soldier in an American uniform. And he knew at that moment that he had been saved. So these things can be stopped. And I shall always be so proud of what has become my country for that moment in Vova Ginsburg's life. And he's still here today because the uniform he saw was an American one. So I want to remember Vytautas Rykkevičius, a Lithuanian Catholic, and I want to remember the American soldier that saved the life of my uncle, Vova Ginsburg. And I want to honor both in support of this resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 030.